Not these days. Not when satellites are photographing license plates from orbit and you can track a pizza delivery driver's turn signal in real time. But there I was, sitting in the dark, staring at a cursor blinking on a black screen, realizing that Fullerton City didn't exist anymore. Or maybe it never did. That was the thought that made the hair on my arms stand up. I work, or worked, I guess, as a freelance data verifier. It's the kind of job you take when you have a degree in library science and a crippling amount of student debt. I verify addresses for bulk mailers, referencing zip codes against municipal databases. It's boring, repetitive, and pays just enough to cover my share of the rent in my parents' basement. The entry on the spreadsheet was standard, *1404 Elm Street, Fullerton City. Oh, *, I typed it into Google Maps, no results found. *, I tried Bing, DuckDuckGo, MapQuest. I even went deep into the county tax assessor's archives, the kind of sites that haven't been updated since 2004 and smell like digital dust. Nothing. I typed just Fullerton City, *0 results. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Not did you mean Fay Fullerton Fay? Or a list of similarly named towns. Just a blank white void. It was like typing a random string of letters. The internet, usually a screaming cacophony of information, was suddenly silent on this one specific thing. It was a digital hole. Then the fan on my PC tower word stuttered and died. The monitor went black. The little green LED on my surge protector flickered out, down the hall, the low hum of the refrigerator. A sound so constant I only noticed it when it was gone. Cut out. Silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy. It pressed against the ears. A physical weight, like water pressure. The air in the basement instantly felt stale, carrying that wet metallic tang you smell right before a transformer blows. "Dad?" I called out. My voice sounded flat in the sudden quiet. No answer. I pushed back from my desk, the wheels of my chair grinding on the thin carpet. I felt for my phone, dead screen. I held down the power button. Nothing. It wasn't just the house power. The battery was fried. A brick. I made my way upstairs. The house was submerged in a gray, late afternoon gloom. The shadows in the corners of the living room seemed to stretch, pooling like spilled oil. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen. They weren't panicking. That was the first thing that scared me. If the power goes out, usually Dad is cursing about the fuse box, and Mom is looking for the flashlights. Not today. Dad was standing by the back door, the one that leads to the patio. He had the tool belt he usually only wears for Saturday repairs strapped around his waist. He held a cordless drill, useless now, in one hand, and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape in the other. He was staring at the glass pane of the door. "Dad?" I asked again. "Power's out. My phone is dead too." He didn't turn around. He didn't even blink. He just set the drill down on the counter with a heavy fade HUD and peeled off a strip of tape. "Fish case shake. Shh." The sound was violent in the quiet room. He plastered the silver tape over the seam of the door frame. Then another strip, then another. "Don't go near the windows, Simon," he said. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. It was the voice you use when reading a grocery list. "And don't touch the blinds." I looked at Mom. She was at the sink, filling every pot pitcher and bowl we owned with tap water. Her movements were jerky, efficient, like a puppet remembering which way to walk. She wasn't looking at the water. She was looking at the window over the sink. "What is going on?" I asked. I could feel a cold knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "Is it a storm? Tornado warning?" Mom turned off the tap. The pipes groaned, a deep shuddering vibration that traveled through the floorboards. She placed a stock pot on the counter, water sloshing over the rim. The grid is down, she said. She wiped her hands on her apron. Cell towers too, it's all gone. How do you know? We know, Dad said. He finished taping the back door and turned to face me. His face was pale, the skin around his eyes tight. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, even though I'd seen him napping in the recliner an hour ago. We need to secure the perimeter. Secure the dad. You are taping the door shut if we need to get out. We don't. He cut me off. He walked past me, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He headed for the front hallway. That is the rule, Simon. Nobody goes outside. I followed him. What rule? Who said that? He ignored me, kneeling by the front door. He slid the deadbolt home. Fake-click. Asterisk, then the chain. Fey-rattle. Clack. Asterisk, then he stood up and dragged the heavy oak coat rack in front of it. Dad, stop. I grabbed his arm. His bicep was rock hard, tense. You are scaring me. What is happening? He looked at me then, really looked at me. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide, swallowing the iris. They looked like dark glass. There was no recognition in them, no fatherly reassurance, just a terrified, pragmatic calculation. The search is over, Simon, he whispered. You stopped finding things. Now things find us. He pulled his arm away and went back to the tape. Fish, asterisk, sealing the edges of the door, sealing us in. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the window in the living room. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of light bled through the gap. I took a step toward it. Don't, Mom screamed from the kitchen. It wasn't a warning. It was a shriek. I froze. Don't look, she said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. If you see it, it sees you. That's how it works. I stood there in the hallway. The smell of dust and ozone thick in my nose. My tech was dead. My parents were strangers wearing familiar skin. And outside, the world had gone wrong. Then the rain started. It didn't start with a drizzle. There was no buildup. 1 second it was silent, and the next, the house was being assaulted. It sounded like gravel being dumped on the roof. Thrum, asterisk, a relentless, deafening barrage. I looked at the ceiling. The sound was too heavy for water. It sounded solid. Dad finished taping the front door. He stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at the sealed door, then at me. Grab the candles from the pantry, he said. And the matches? Stay away from the exterior walls. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. Because, he said, turning to walk back to the kitchen, leaving me alone in the darkening hall. The forecast called for clear skies. I stood there, listening to the impossible rain hammer against the shingles. The house felt smaller now. Every taped seam, every locked bolt, every drawn blind was shrinking the world down to these few rooms. Fallatan City wasn't on the map, and looking at the darkness gathering at the top of the stairs, I wasn't sure we were anymore, either. Asterisk. The pantry smelled of stale paprika and dry rot. I fumbled for the box of emergency candles on the top shelf, my fingers brushing against sticky jars of preserves that had likely expired before I finished high school. The house groaned. It was a low, structural complaint, the wood settling under the weight of the unnatural rain hammering the roof. I found the matches. The box was damp, the striker strip peeling at the corner. Hurry up, Mark whispered from the kitchen doorway. He was 19, built like a linebacker, but he stood with his shoulders hunched, arms wrapped around himself like a kid waiting for a scolding. The lights just flickered again. I got them, I said. We moved back to the living room. Dad had pushed the heavy oak coffee table to the center of the rug, as far from the walls as the furniture allowed. He was pacing the perimeter of that makeshift island, a roll of silver duct tape clutched in his hand like a grenade. He checked the window seals again and again. Faithump asterisk, the power died. No flicker, no surge, just an abrupt heavy darkness that felt like a physical weight dropping onto us. "Don't move," Dad said. His voice was flat, hard. "Light one candle, only one." I struck a match. The sulfur flared, choking and sharp before the wick caught. The small flame pushed the shadows back, but only just. It painted the room in flickering shades of orange and black, turning the familiar contours of the armchair and the bookshelf into foreign, lurking shapes. We sat on the floor, backs against the coffee table. Me, Mark, Dad. The rain outside was a constant, roaring static, drowning out the usual house noises. The refrigerator hummed, the water pipes, the wind in the chimney. Then came the sound that cut through it all. Feyrat. Tap, tap asterisk. It was crisp, rhythmic, and terrifyingly deliberate. It sounded like bone striking glass. I looked at the front window. The heavy curtains were drawn, taped shut at the seams, but the sound came from right behind them. Feyrat, tap, tap. Asterisks, Dad? Mark started, his voice pitching up. Dad's hand shot out, gripping Mark's knee, squeezing hard enough to bruise. He didn't look at us. His eyes were fixed on the curtain. The sound moved. Feyrat, tap, tap. Asterisk, now it was at the side window, near the television. It wasn't random debris caught in the storm. It was traveling. Something was walking the perimeter of the house, testing the shell, looking for a soft spot. I held my breath. My chest felt tight, constricted by a cold pressure. The knocking continued, circling us counter clockwise. It was methodical, industrial, like a quality control inspector checking a weld or a butcher testing the thickness of a skull. Feyrat, tap, tap, asterisk, kitchen window. Feyrat, tap, tap, asterisk, back door. "It's circling," I whispered. The realization sat heavy in my gut, cold as a stone. "It's checking the exits." "Shut up," Dad hissed. The words were barely a breath, forcing their way through clenched teeth. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The rain still roared, but the specific, intelligent rhythm was gone. The absence of it felt like a held breath. I found myself straining to hear it again, just to know where the thing was. Mark shifted. He was looking at the small, diamond-shaped window high up on the west wall. It was purely decorative, a relic of the house's 1970s design, too high to tape over easily. Dad had missed it. "There's something?" Mark murmured. He started to stand up. "Sit down," Dad ordered, low and urgent. "No, look," Mark said, pointing. The rain stopped hitting that glass. I looked up. He was right. The little diamond pane was dark, blacker than the surrounding gloom. The rain lashed against the siding, but that one patch of glass was shielded. Something was pressed against it. Then the darkness shifted. It wasn't a shadow. It was a pupil. A massive, wet eye filled the entire frame. It had no white, just a sickly, yellowed sclera veined with thick, pulsing black lines. The pupil was a horizontal slit, like a goat's, but ragged at the edges. It swiveled, jerky and mechanical. Scanning the room, it saw the candle. The pupil contracted. Focusing, Mark let out a sound, a high, strangled whimper, and scrambled backward, his sneakers squeaking sharply on the hardwood. "Get away from..." Dad launched himself across the gap. He didn't tackle the intruder. He tackled Mark. He slammed his youngest son into the carpet with a violence that made the floorboards shudder. "Quiet," Dad roared. But it was a roar stripped of volume, a desperate, pressurized whisper. He clamped a hand over Mark's mouth, pinning him down. Not a sound. Mark thrashed for a second, eyes wide and terrified, before going limp under Dad's weight. I looked back at the window. The eye was gone. But the glass didn't look right. It was bowing inward. Fake-reeg. Asterisk the sound of stress. The sound of glass being pushed to its tolerance limit. Dad froze. His hand still over Mark's mouth. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with sweat in the candlelight. He raised a finger to his lips. We waited. The house felt like a submarine at crushed depth. The air was stale, smelling of burnt wick and terror sweat. Then, from the other side of the wall, a sound, a wet suction. Cup fey pop fey, followed by a slithering noise, like a heavy wet tarp being dragged over the shingles. It moved up, toward the roof. Fey hump, asterisk faith hump. Asterisk faith hump, asterisk steps. Heavy, uneven steps walking directly over our heads. Dust motes danced in the candlelight as the ceiling plaster vibrated. Dad slowly released Mark. He sat up, his movements stiff, like an old man. He stared at the ceiling, tracking the sound. "They're testing the seals," Dad whispered. He wasn't talking to us anymore. He was reciting facts, analyzing data. "They know we're in here. They just can't see the way in yet." "What was that?" Mark gasped, rubbing his jaw where Dad had pinned him. "Dad, that was an eye the size of a dinner plate. What the hell is happening?" Dad grabbed Mark by the collar of his shirt, pulling him close. The look in Dad's eyes was terrifying. It wasn't anger. It was the absolute, hollow look of a man who has done the math and didn't like the sum. "Listen to me," Dad said. "The rules aren't for them. They're for us. We stay away from the walls. We keep the light low, and we keep our mouths shut." "But silence is the wall, Mark?" Dad shook him once. "Silence is the only thing thicker than that glass. You make noise. You let them in, you acknowledge them, you invite them. Do you understand?" Mark nodded. Tears streaking his face. Above us, the walking stopped. Then directly over the center of the room, right above the chandelier, it started again. Feyrat, tap, tap, asterisk. It wasn't knocking on the wall anymore. It was knocking on the roof, asking to come in. Dad blew out the candle. "Don't answer," he whispered in the dark. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The silence didn't last. It never does. It just coils, tightening, until something snaps. The Feyrat tap, tap fey on the roof had barely faded into the low, static hum of the night when the front door exploded with noise. Not the rhythmic, testing knock of the things outside. This was frantic, desperate, meat and bone slamming against reinforced oak. "Open up, please, God, let us in." A human voice, high, ragged, and wet with panic. Dad froze, his hand hovering over the deadbolt. He looked at me, his eyes hard and glassy in the gloom. Rule 4, never open the door after sundown. Asterisk, it was the first rule we learned. The one that kept the air inside stale and safe. "It is the Hollows," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Dad, it's Mr. Hollow." "Quiet," Dad hissed. "Please." The voice on the other side cracked, dissolving into a sob. "Sarah's hurt. They're shifting the road." Dad cursed a sharp, ugly sound. He checked the reinforced peephole, then the heavy iron bar we used to brace the frame. He looked at the clock on the wall, stuck at 9:47 p.m. since Tuesday, and then back at the door. The calculation took a second. Human chaos versus the calculated quiet. He pulled the bar. "Get back," he told us. He threw the bolt and yanked the door open. The night air rushed in, smelling of ozone and scorched rubber. Mr. and Mrs. Hallow tumbled over the threshold in a tangle of limbs and expensive gore. Tex jackets. Dad slammed the door shut behind them, throwing the bolt and jamming the iron bar back into place in one fluid, practiced motion. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening nothing but the wind, and a low scratching sound, like a needle dragging across vinyl, fading into the distance. Check the windows, Dad barked at me. I moved. I checked the blackout curtains in the living room, the kitchen, the hall, all sealed, duct tape holding the edges. No light leaking out. When I got back to the entryway, the Hallows were standing up. They looked wrong. Mr. Hallow, a man who usually spent his weekends manicuring his lawn with surgical precision, was vibrating. His polo shirt was torn, and his eyes were wide, darting around our hallway like trapped birds. Mrs. Hallow was worse. She leaned heavily against him, her face the color of old ash. "Thank you," Mr. Hallow wheezed. "Thank you, Frank." The streetlights. They started blinking in Morse code, and then the asphalt got soft. "Come to the kitchen," Dad said. His voice was flat, dismissive. "We're eating." We weren't eating. We had finished hours ago. But Dad marched them into the kitchen and pointed at the chairs. It was a command, not an offer. We sat in the semi-darkness, illuminated only by a single battery-powered camping lantern turned to its lowest setting. The shadows stretched long and thin across the table, distorting our faces. Dad put 2 bowls of cold canned peaches in front of them. "Eat," Dad said. "I can't," Mrs. Hallow whispered. She was gripping her thigh. Her knuckles were white. "I think I need a doctor, Frank." "No doctors," Dad said, opening a can of beans for himself. "Phone lines are dead. Cell towers are down. Eat your peaches." The normalcy was a weapon. Dad wielded it like a bludgeon. He asked Mr. Hallow about his gutter guards. He complained about the humidity in the basement. He spoke about the weather as if the sky outside wasn't currently the color of a bruised plum. Mr. Hallow played along. He started talking, too fast, about the homeowners association fees. He spooned peaches into his mouth, chewing mechanically, his eyes still screaming. "The Joneses didn't pay this month," Mr. Hallow said, a drop of syrup running down his chin. "I was going to send a letter, a stern letter. But then the mailbox, it had teeth. Frank, it had teeth. Rust," Dad said, not looking up from his beans. "Metal degrades, sharp edges." "Right, rust." Mr. Hallow nodded, desperate to believe. "Just rust." I looked under the table, at Mrs. Hallow's leg. Her jeans were dark, soaked through, but the stain wasn't red. It was a shimmering, oil-slick black, and it wasn't dripping. The fabric of her pants was moving, undulating slightly, as if the fibers were trying to reweave themselves into a different pattern. There was a smell, not copper. It smelled like bleach and potting soil. "Mrs. Hallow," I said. "Your leg. Don't look at it," she snapped. Her voice dropped an octave, scraping the bottom of her throat. It wasn't the voice of a suburban housewife. It sounded like 2 stones grinding together. "It is just a scratch. A dog bit me." "A dog," I repeated. "A big dog," Mr. Hallow said, nodding vigorously. "Stray? I'll call animal control in the morning." I looked at Dad. He saw it too. He was staring at the black stain spreading on the linoleum floor beneath her chair. It wasn't pooling. It was eating into the tile, dissolving the geometric pattern of the vinyl. Dad stood up. "Guest room tonight. You stay in there. You don't come out until sunup. Use the bucket if you have to. But Sarah needs guest room." Dad's hand went to his belt, resting near the heavy flashlight he used as a club. We ushered them into the back room. It was a small space, windowless. Originally a pantry we'd converted for storage. It had a solid core door and a heavy slide bolt on the Fayside Fay. Dad didn't mention the lock. He just handed them a bottle of water and a blanket. Mrs. Hallow limped across the threshold. As she passed me, the smell hit me harder, damp earth and static electricity. She turned to look at me, and for a second, the lantern light caught her eyes. The pupils weren't round. They were fractured, like broken glass. Don't listen to the knocking, she whispered. A secret between friends. It is not trying to get in. It is trying to let you out. Dad slammed the door. Fey clack. Thud asterisk, he slid the bolt home. Go to bed, Dad said. He grabbed a chair and dragged it to the hallway, sitting directly in front of the guest room door. He put the flashlight on his lap. I went to my room, but I didn't sleep. I lay on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house settled. The wood groaned. The wind outside howled, sounding less like air and more like a chorus of breathless voices. But from the guest room, there was nothing. No crying, no whispering, no movement, just a silence that felt heavy, pressing against the walls like deep water. Around 3 a.m., I heard a sound. Not a knock. It was a wet, tearing noise, like peeling a sticker off a piece of paper, but magnified. Fish. Asterisk then. A thump, soft final. I held my breath. I waited for Dad to shout, for the bolt to rattle, but the silence rushed back in, thicker than before. Morning came gray and sickly. The light filtering through the taped curtains was the color of dirty dishwater. I found Dad asleep in the chair, his head lolling against his chest. The bolt was still thrown. The door was still shut. Dad! I shook him. He woke with a start, gripping the flashlight. He looked at the door, then at me. He stood up, his joints popping, and put his ear to the wood. Mr. Hallow? Silence. Sarah. Nothing. Dad gripped the bolt. He pulled it back slowly. The metal screeched too loud in the quiet house. He turned the knob and pushed. The room was empty. The water bottle was unopened. The blanket was folded neatly on the floor. Mr. Hallow sat in the corner, knees pulled to his chest, rocking back and forth. He was staring at the wall, but Mrs. Hallow was gone. There was no window. The ventilation grunt was screwed tight, painted over with layers of latex. The door had been bolted from the outside. Where is she? Dad asked. His voice was tight. Mr. Hallow looked up. His eyes were blank, washed clean of panic, replaced by a terrible, vacant calm. He pointed at the wall behind him. I looked. On the plaster, right in the center of the wall, was a stain. A black, oily scorch mark in the shape of a human shadow. It wasn't painted on. It was burned fin to fin. The drywall sunk deep, as if the material itself had rotted away instantly. The edges of the shadow were fuzzy, vibrating, sinking into the studs. She found the door, Mr. Hallow said softly. She said the geometry was all wrong. She said she could fit. I stepped closer. The smell of bleach and potting soil was overpowering. In the center of the shadow, where the chest would be, the drywall was wet. Pulsing, Dad grabbed Mr. Hallow by the collar and hauled him up. Get out. But the dog. Out. We pushed him into the hallway. Dad didn't look back at the room. He slammed the door and threw the bolt again. He grabbed the duct tape from the kitchen and started sealing the cracks around the frame. Layer after layer, silver strips over the wood. Dad, I said. How? She was marked. Dad said. He didn't stop taping. Ferrip, smooth, rip, smooth. Asterisk, she wasn't a person anymore. She was a doorway. He turned to me. His face was gray, lined with exhaustion. We don't open the door again, he said. Not for anyone, not even if they scream. From inside the guest room, behind the bolted door and the layers of tape, a sound started. Firet tapped asterisk on the inside of the wall. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mr. Hallow didn't stop at the hallway. He dragged Alice toward the front door, his boots skidding on the hardwood. He was shouting something about finding her and fixing this. But the words were slurry, wet, like his mouth was full of water. Alice wasn't fighting him. She was limp, a rag doll with wide staring eyes that didn't seem to track the movement of the room anymore. Don't, Dad said. He didn't move from the taped up guest room door. He didn't even raise his voice. It was a flat statement of fact. You break the seal, you let the pressure in. She is out there, Mr. Hallow screamed. He fumbled with the deadbolt. His hands were shaking so bad the keys jingled like wind chimes in a gale. My wife is out there. Your wife is gone, Dad said. He smoothed the strip of silver tape over the doorframe. Feezip, smooth. Asterisk, whatever is out there is just wearing her shape. Mr. Hallow didn't listen. He got the lock to turn. The mechanism gave a heavy metallic fake lunkfei that vibrated through the floorboards. I stepped back, pressing my spine against the kitchen island. The air in the house felt thin, electrically charged. The hair on my arms stood up. It smelled like scorched wiring and old pennies. Alice, I said. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the sudden drop in air pressure. Don't go. She looked at me. For a second, her eyes cleared. She looked terrified. Then Mr. Hallow kicked the door open. The night didn't look like night. It looked like static. A wall of gray, shifting fog rolled over the threshold, heavy and smelling of wet earth and rot. It didn't drift. It poured, curling around Mr. Hallow's ankles like liquid. Sarah, he yelled into the gray. He pulled Alice through the doorway. The door didn't slam shut behind them. It just stood there, gaping open, letting the outside bleed in. Then the sound started. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was a clicking, a dry, rhythmic tick that sounded like 1,000 dry knuckles cracking at once. Or chitin rubbing against bone. It started low, a vibration in the teeth, and then it spiked. Click, click, click. Asterisk, I clapped my hands over my ears. But the sound didn't care about flesh or bone. It bypassed the eardrum and went straight to the stem of the brain. It was the sound of something vast and many-legged testing the structural integrity of reality. Mr. Hallow fired his gun. The shots were dull pops, swallowed instantly by the clicking. 1, 2, 3. Then a scream, high, ragged, and abruptly cut off. Not silenced, phase-mothered. Asterisk like a candle pinched out by wet fingers. Alice didn't scream. I slid down the front of the cabinets, knees hitting the linoleum. My nose was bleeding. I could taste the copper in the back of my throat. The clicking was deafening now. A wall of noise that rattled the dishes in the drying rack. It sounded like the house was being chewed. I looked at Dad. He was still standing by the guest room door. He had stopped taping. His hands hung loose at his sides. The roll of duct tape dropped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud that I felt more than heard. He wasn't scared. That was the worst part. The terror, the frantic survival instinct that had kept us alive for 3 days. It was gone. His face was slack. His jaw hung slightly open, eyes unfocused, staring at the open front door where the gray fog was piling up in drift, banks against the coat rack. Dad? I tried to yell, but I couldn't hear myself. He turned his head slowly. The movement was jerky, mechanical, like a puppet remembering which way to walk. He looked at me, and then he smiled. It wasn't a dad smile, it was a muscle spasm, a placid, empty expression that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were flat, reflecting the gray static from outside. It is settling, he said. I read his lips. Mom walked out of the bedroom. She was wearing her bathrobe. She looked calm, too calm. She walked past me, her bare feet making no sound on the floor, and stood next to Dad. She took his hand. They stood there, facing the open door, facing the clicking fog, like a couple watching a sunset. The noise, Mom said. I saw the shape of the words. It's efficient. My stomach turned over. The bile rose up, hot and acidic. The clicking wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a frequency. It was rewriting them. The panic, the adrenaline, the human need to survive. It was being scrubbed out, replaced by this wet, gray acceptance. They weren't my parents anymore. They were livestock waiting for the chute. I looked at the open door. The fog was halfway down the hall. In the swirling mist, I saw shapes, jerky, angular movements, things that had too many joints. They moved with a synchronized shudder, stepping over the threshold. Fake click, click. Asterisk, the house wasn't a fortress. It was a pantry, and the seal was broken. I scrambled backward, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. I grabbed the handle of the back door. It was locked, deadbolted. I looked back at them. Dad raised a hand, pointing at me, not in warning. He was pointing me out, like he was showing a guest where the bathroom was. Join, he mouthed. I didn't think. I didn't say goodbye. Survival is a cold, selfish thing. It doesn't have room for sentiment. I smashed the glass of the back door window with my elbow. The pain flared hot and sharp, grounding me. I reached through, unlocked the deadbolt, and threw the door open. The backyard was dark, but the gray fog hadn't circled all the way around yet. The air was cold and smelled of ozone and wet grass. I ran. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the silhouette of my parents standing hand in the hallway, bathed in the gray light, waiting to be processed. I just ran toward the tree line, my breath tearing at my lungs, the clicking sound chasing me like a swarm of locusts. Behind me, the house let out a long structural groan, a sound of wood giving way, of walls bending. The clicking changed. It synchronized Feyrat. Tap, tap, asterisk. Every tree in the forest echoed it back. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Mark was waiting in the Honda. The engine was idling, a rough, rhythmic chug that sounded too loud against the backdrop of the clicking trees. I threw myself into the passenger seat, slamming the door just as a shadow detached itself from the porch of my childhood home. Go, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like gravel in a mixer. Mark didn't ask questions. He slammed the gear shift into drive, and the tires squealed against the wet asphalt. The force pinned me to the seat, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and pine air freshener filling the cabin. A mundane smell, a safe smell. We tore down Maple Street, the high beams cutting cones of white into the gray fog that was swallowing the neighborhood. Did you get them? Mark asked. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Your folks? I looked out the window. The houses were dark, but the lawns weren't empty. Mrs. Higgins, 3 doors down, was on her front lawn. She was wearing her floral nightgown. But she wasn't standing. She was arranged. Her limbs were bent at angles that bone doesn't allow. Her left leg was folded behind her head. Her arms pleated against her chest like a mantis. She looked like a piece of wet paper someone had crumpled and tossed aside. An origami corpse. Don't look, I muttered. A rule I just made up. Rule 1. Don't look at the neighbors. Mark swerved to avoid something in the road. The mailman, or what was left of him. He was twisted into a perfect sphere, head tucked into his knees, spine snapped in a dozen places to make the geometry work. The fog was thicker now. It pressed against the windows, heavy and opaque. The radio static rose, a white noise hiss that sounded like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Where are we going? Mark shouted over the static. White Valley, I said. The substation, it's outside the grid. But the road didn't go to White Valley. Not anymore. Mark slammed on the brakes. The Honda skidded, the smell of burning rubber mixing with the ozone. We had stopped in the parking lot of the Right Grocery. The fluorescent sign flickered overhead. The Fay Fay and Fay Fay burnt out, leaving just Fayui Et Fay. The lot was full. Cars were abandoned with doors wide open, and the people were walking. They moved in a single file line, a slow, shuffling procession toward the sliding glass doors of the store. No one was running. No one was screaming. They walked with a terrifying, synchronized calm. "Reverse," I said. "Mark, reverse the car." "I can't," Mark whispered. He was staring at the dashboard. The gear shift was stuck. The engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was heavy. It had weight. Then I saw them walking past the hood of our car, hand in hand. My father wore his Sunday cardigan. My mother was in her slippers. They looked peaceful. Their eyes were wide, black pits that reflected the flickering neon, but their mouths were curved into serene, vacant smiles. "Mom," I breathed. I opened the door before I realized what I was doing. The air outside tasted like copper and ozone, a wet, metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. "Art, don't," Mark hissed, grabbing my sleeve. I shook him off. I had to know. I followed them. I merged into the line of shuffling figures, keeping my head down, mimicking their gait. Rule 2, blend in. We moved through the automatic doors. The blast of air conditioning was freezing, smelling of Freon and rotting fruit. The store was gutted. The shelves were pushed to the walls, creating a massive, empty arena in the center of the linoleum floor. Except it wasn't floor anymore. The center of the grocery store had been hollowed out. A massive, jagged pit dropped away into darkness, where the produce section used to be. The edges of the hole were slick with a black, viscous fluid. The sound coming from the pit was a low, wet thrumming, like a massive heart beating miles beneath the earth. Fey thump. Squelch. Thump. Squelch. Asterisk. The line moved forward. The person at the front, Mr. Henderson, the gym teacher, stepped to the edge. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look down. He simply stepped out into the void. He fell without a sound. My parents were next. They walked to the edge. They squeezed each other's hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a frantic insect sound. "Mom, Dad," I screamed. The sound tore out of my throat, raw and burning. They stopped for a second. The rhythm broke. My father's head turned slowly, like a rusted hinge. He looked at me. The smile didn't waver. It was painted on. "It is okay, Arthur," he said. His voice wasn't his. It was flat, monotonic. "We are being archived. Come with us," my mother added. Her eyes were empty glass. "The geometry is beautiful down there." They stepped forward together. 1 second they were there, framed against the abyss. The next, they were gone. Swallowed by the dark, the floor beneath me groaned. The tiles cracked, shooting spider webs of white dust across the surface. "Run!" Mark was there, grabbing my collar, hauling me back. The trance broke. The clicking sound exploded in the store, louder now, coming from the ceiling, from the vents, from the pit itself. Feyrat, tap, 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 tap. Asterisk, we scrambled back through the shattered glass of the entrance. The parking lot was shaking. The asphalt rippled like water. We dove into the Honda. Mark twisted the key. The engine whined, coughed, and roared to life. He threw it into reverse, the tires smoking as we shot backward, clipping the bumper of a sedan. "Look," Mark choked out. He was staring into the rear-view mirror. I looked. Rising from the roof of the grocery store was a shape. It was impossible to quantify. It looked like a skyscraper made of static and shadow, towering hundreds of feet into the night. It had limbs, too many limbs, that unfolded like a darkly blooming flower. It was rearranging the building, folding the concrete and steel, as easily as it had folded Mrs. Higgins. A single, massive eye opened in the center of the mass. It was the color of a dying sun. "Drive," I said. "Don't stop. Don't look back." Mark floored it. We tore out of the lot, hitting the main road. leaving the town and the fog behind. The scenery blurred, the clicking faded, replaced by the roar of wind and the frantic beating of my own heart. We crossed the county line into White Valley 20 minutes later. The streetlights here were steady, amber normal. Mark pulled into a gas station, the car shuddering as he killed the engine. We sat there for a long time, just breathing. The silence here wasn't heavy, it was just silence. A state trooper pulled up to the pump next to us. He got out, adjusting his belt, looking at us with mild suspicion. Two guys in a beat-up Honda, sweating, smelling of fear and ozone. "You boys all right?" he asked. "Look like you seen a ghost." I looked at Mark. Then I looked at the trooper. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my pack of cigarettes. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the lighter twice. "Just car trouble," I said. The lie tasted like ash. "Just a long night." The trooper nodded, disinterested, and turned to the pump. I watched the digital numbers on the gas pump scroll up, mundane, predictable, orderly, but in the reflection of the station window, I could still see the fog on the horizon. And I knew the rules had changed. The job wasn't just night shift anymore. We were overtime now.